For any reaction, the amount of product formed or the amount of reactants required is always essential. To tackle this type of question, start with writing the balance equation for the reaction. Then, calculate the mole of the substance and use ratio to calculate the mole of the desired substance. Lastly, using mole knowledge, calculate the mass of the substance. Let's go into this example. Calculate the amount in grams of sodium chloride formed in a reaction of 3.5 grams of sodium sulfate and excess barium chloride. So let's start with writing a balance equation. Then, since the mass of sodium sulfate is given, calculate the mole of sodium sulfate. So we know that mole is equivalent to mass over molar mass. The mass is given 3.5 and the molar mass you can get from the periodic table. Key in the value and key in inside the calculator. We will have 0.0246 mole. And then use ratio to calculate the mole of sodium chloride. So the ratio of sodium sulfate and sodium chloride is 1:2. Ratio is the comparison from the coefficient of the substance in a balance equation. It's like if sodium sulfate has 1 rabbit, then sodium chloride has 2 rabbits of the same kind. And since sodium sulfate has 0.0246 mole, hence sodium chloride has twice the value at 0.0492. From the mole, we can calculate the mass of sodium chloride. The molar mass of sodium chloride can be obtained from the periodic table. Key in inside the calculator. Therefore, we have mass of sodium chloride produced is 2.88. Let me introduce you to limiting reagent in this hypothetical example. Imagine having two reactants, bread and cheese, to make sandwich as a product. To make the sandwich, you will require 2 bread and 1 cheese in the middle. So start with the reaction, 2 bread, 1 cheese, the first sandwich. Another one, 2 bread, 1 cheese, the second sandwich. 2 bread, 1 cheese, the third sandwich. And as you can see, there is no more cheese and there is an excess bread. So the cheese is called limiting reagent. And no matter how much excess bread is left, there is only 3 sandwiches because there is only 3 cheese. So the amount of product produced depends on how much limiting reagent there is. Mass of product obtained from balance equation are theoretical mass, but assuming that all reactants reacted. In actual fact, the yield of the product is slightly lower than expected due to various reasons. To calculate the efficiency of the experiment through percent yield, the steps include calculating the mole of the first reagent, and then calculating the mole of the second reagent, and use both of the mole to determine the mole of the substance. The reagent that produces the least mole of the product is the limiting reagent, and hence calculate the theoretical yield of the product based on the limiting reagent. And percent yield can be calculated using this equation. Let's go into this example. Solution containing 12.8 grams of sulfuric acid and 10 grams of sodium hydroxide are mixed and produce 14.3 grams of sodium sulfate and water as a byproduct. The balance equation is already given. Calculate the percent yield of sodium sulfate. The mass of sodium sulfate given in the question, this is the actual yield of sodium sulfate. Now, we need to determine the theoretical yield of sodium sulfate. So let's start with the calculation. We can divide the calculation into calculation based on NaOH and calculation based on sulfuric acid. So let's start with NaOH first. So calculate the mole of sodium hydroxide. The mass is given, which is 10 gram. 40 is the molar mass of sodium hydroxide. Key in inside the calculator, we will have 0.25 mole. And the ratio of sodium hydroxide to sodium sulfate is 2 to 1. Therefore, the mole of sodium sulfate is half of sodium hydroxide. Do the same for sulfuric acid. Calculate its mole. We have 12.8 gram divided by the molar mass, and we have 0.13 mole. And the ratio of sulfuric acid to sodium carbonate is 1 to 1. Therefore, the mole of sodium sulfate is equivalent to the mole of sulfuric acid. And as you can see, the mole of sodium sulfate from NaOH is lower compared to the mole of sodium sulfate coming from sulfuric acid. Therefore, we can say that sodium hydroxide is the limiting reagent. So calculate the mass of sodium sulfate. So we have the mole from the limiting reagent. This is the molar mass that you can get from the periodic table. And we can have the theoretical yield as 17.8 gram. Insert inside equation actual yield divided by theoretical yield multiplied with 100. So key in the value, and hence we have 80.3%.